Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the April 2015 ERM Toolbox webinar. Thanks for your patience. We were having a little bit of technical difficulty behind the scene getting connected, but everything is up and ready to go now. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you've dialed in by phone but haven't logged in by computer and you would like to see the slides for today's presentation, please point your web browser to readytalk.com. In the box where it says Participant Join a Meeting, enter the same access code that you used for the call, 9879821. On the next screen, scroll down to the bottom of the invitation, enter your contact info, and then click the button to register, and you will be placed in the webinar. Please stay aware of the level of background noise in your area, and if it becomes noisy, that is, please put your phone on mute. If your phone doesn't have a mute button, you can use the ReadyTalk controls, which are *6 to mute and *7 to unmute. Also, I'll be monitoring the phone lines and can mute individual ones if they become noisy as well. If you're called away from your phone, please don't put your phone on hold, because that will cause your hold music to be transmitted to everyone else on the call. You can simply hang up, dial back in, and it will not disrupt the call. As mentioned, we're leaving the phone lines open, so if you have questions, you can ask them during the presentation. Or if you'd prefer to use the chat box, feel free to type a question there. I'll be keeping an eye on those, and we'll relay them to our presenter at an appropriate time. So let me introduce our presenter today, Mark Priven. After being drafted last in kickball, dodgeball, handball, tetherball, softball, and virtually every other school sport, Mark realized early on he should hit the books. Upon failing penmanship, he surveyed his remedial reading class and figured anything involving letters would not be his salvation. Luckily, there was math. He transitioned easily from high school nerd to college geek to actuary, and has been working as an actuary for over 20 years, including the past 15 years at Bickmore, in which he has helped both public and private self-insurers quantify and analyze their risk. Mark serves on the WCIRB Actuarial Committee on behalf of the public members who represent labor and employers. He's also assisted multiple states in overseeing self-insurance, and he oversees Bickmore's actuarial analyses of UC's workers' compensation program. Mark?
All right, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Emily?
Sounds loud and clear.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you very much for the privilege of doing this presentation. I'm really happy to do it. And as Emily said, if anybody has any questions or concerns or whatever, feel free to speak up, or I guess you can write on the web there, and I'll be monitoring that to see if there are any questions. What I'm just going to go over is basically what's going on in California workers' compensation in general in the state, and also for UC specifically. The state's workers' comp system has been, I would characterize it as a pretty wild ride for a long time, but particularly in the last 10 years or so, there have been some major reforms. So what I wanted to do was go through sort of the backdrop to those reforms, what the reforms were, and how UC's experience compares with the statewide regarding the things that sort of gave impetus to the reforms, and also post-reform information. So I'll just go ahead and start. And again, if anyone has questions, feel free to ask them. So I'm not sure I have control here, Emily.
Okay. Do you want to just say next slide and I'll take care of advancing?
Yeah, so go ahead, go to the next slide and then the next slide again. So here are some images that hopefully by the end of this presentation will trigger some thoughts for you about the California workers' compensation system. They all have their own sort of specific meaning, which hopefully will become clear throughout this next hour or so. So the next slide shows, go on the next one, there we go. So this is really my visualization of what the pre-reform California system looked like. And by pre-reform, I mean 2012 and prior. There were some big reforms which occurred in 2012 in SB 863. And the theme of this is upside down. So we have Spider-Man's Upside Down Kiss. We have Diana Ross, for those of you that remember this album. There was the big hit Upside Down in it, which I will not sing, or else I will quickly see this audience disappear long before the hour's over. But that was her famous Upside Down disco album. In the upper right-hand corner, we have Grandma's Upside Down Cake. And then in the lower right, we have the California Workers' Comp system. And what that blue bar represents is the average amount of permanent disability that an injured worker who had permanent disability got. So someone in California, in comparison to the statewide total. So in general, an injured worker with permanent disability in California got 30% lower benefits than an injured worker in an average state. On the other hand, on the right, we have the filed rates, which represents what employers who buy insurance are paying. And we can see here that employers are paying rates that are 55% higher than the average. So this was clearly a system that's upside down and out of whack. We have the cost of the system in total was over 50% higher than average, and yet what was going to injured workers, particularly those who are most injured with permanent disabilities, were getting 30% less. And so really what one of the major goals of the system, of the reform was to increase that benefit to injured workers so they would get higher permanent disability benefits without increasing that green line, without increasing the rates, and in fact trying to actually make the rates go down a little bit. So it was quite a trick to increase costs in some ways, but to keep the overall cost either steady or down. So I'll go through a little bit about where that money is going to come from. So the first thing is expenses. So in the workers' comp system is, if you looked at it compared to like the healthcare system or Social Security or other sort of what we call social insurance systems, it is extremely inefficient. So this pie chart shows where your dollars go, and this wouldn't be for UC, this would be for those who buy insurance. But you can see that indemnity payments represent those payments that go to injured workers. Medical payments are for medical care, but over a third of the dollars goes to other. So whether that's lawyers, brokers, actuaries, claims adjusters, you name it. It's all other, but it's all not going to the injured worker or to medical care. And that percentage of other expense is much, much higher in workers' comp, again, than it is in almost any other sort of social insurance type system like disability insurance, unemployment insurance, those types of things. So one of the goals of SB 863 was to take the money out of other and to put it into indemnity, which is where the money that goes to injured workers goes. So on the next slide, this is benchmarked California against other states. And so those other states are the red lines, and they're ranked from sort of bottom, lowest to highest in quintiles. And you can see that the lowest, the expenses, and this is loss adjustment expense, so this would be TPA, mostly TPA, attorney, things like that. In the lowest states, that's only about 13% of what goes to injured workers and medical care, whereas in the highest state, it's 26.4, and California was right there near the highest. So again, one of the goals, there was a lot of room, we thought, for California to lower its expenses in relation to other states. And I'll just back up and just say, I think I forgot to mention what my role was in this whole thing. So the reform which occurred was basically negotiated between labor and management, meaning employers, and under the auspices of the Department of Industrial Relations. And I was what I'll call the scorekeeper. So they would present options. What if we did this? What if we did that? And I would go back to my computer and calculate that this will save you 10%, or this will cost you 5%, or whatever. And that's sort of how they kept score in order to make sure that the overall cost didn't go up while giving more benefits to injured workers. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about UC specifically. So as I mentioned, California in general has extremely high expenses in relation to the actual benefits that go to injured workers and medical care. UC actually fares much better. One of the reasons that expenses are so high is litigation. And so what these lines represent are the percent of permanent disability claims that are litigated. And you can see that there, the solid blue line is the northern campuses, the red line is the southern, and as you would expect, the southern has a little bit more litigation than the north. Now if you go to the next slide, this shows what the medical centers have. So overall, the medical centers sort of perform very closely to the campuses. Again, there being a difference between Northern and Southern California. Now, the next slide shows, however, what the rest of the state looks like in terms of what the rating bureau or the insurance world looks like. So those dotted lines are basically an amalgamation of all the employers that purchase insurance in California. It's about 2/3 of the market. And you can see that in Northern California, whereas roughly 20% of UC's claims are litigated, the statewide average is more like 60%. And in Southern California, whereas the UC average is somewhere in the 30 to 40% range, it's more like 80% in the rest of the state. So part of these reforms were addressing expenses, which thankfully the UC system does not have as high a problem with in terms of litigation and all the costs that go with litigation. The next slide shows basically the components of the reform. On the left-hand side were the cost increases, and again, the major parts were, PD stands for permanent disability. So the major increases were to benefits directly given to injured workers for permanently disabling injuries. And they were phased in somewhere in 2013 and somewhere in 2014. And on the right-hand side are all the cost savings, all the cost savings. So the first one being liens, and then the next one is independent medical review and some other issues. So I'll go into a couple of those. I'm not going to go in too much detail, but just to give you a flavor of what those are and what the reforms were to try to mitigate them. But first I'm going to talk about how the increases to permanent disability worked. So if we go to the next slide, one of the themes of the reform was that there would be no losers, and by that I mean that when you change a complex system, sometimes you may increase benefits in total, but some individuals may get more of that, while other individuals may actually wind up with fewer benefits than they would have gotten under the old system. And that was not going to be acceptable in this reform. So everybody that post-reform had to be at least as well off as they would have been pre-reform. Nobody could essentially lose out by the reform. Some people could make out better than others, but nobody could lose out. So this is actually my daughter. So she was kind enough to pose for this. I don't think she knew that this was going to be part of an actual presentation, but I just told her to give the loser sign. And actually, this is my home office here. Now that I think about it, as I look around, this is actually the background. So again, the theme was no losers. And so in practice, how did that work out? So let's go to the next slide. And here's a concrete example. So one of the things that happens when folks get permanent disability, the way the rating works is that first a doctor determines how impaired you are from your particular injury, and then there's a determination on how much that impairment impacts your ability to earn wages. So the part of that conversion is the future earning capacity. So for example, let's say two people are injured and they both have 20%, they're considered to be 20% disabled from that injury, but one injury, let's say you're a piano player and you injure your hand, that's going to be only a 20% injury, but it's going to be 100% impact on your earnings. Whereas if you're an actuary and I'm a righty and I injured my left hand, that would be a very small impact on my ability to earn income. So there has to be a conversion from the injury to how it might impact earnings. So what was determined was there's a big difference depending on the type of injury. So for example, people with hearing loss tended to have higher earnings loss than people with the same percent disability, or the same percent disability. They tend to have the same a larger earnings loss, and the state wanted to get rid of this conversion factor from earnings loss, from the disability to the earnings loss, because it was a high source of litigation. So people were saying, oh, well, I'm only this percent injured, but it impacts my earnings much more. And so there was a lot of dispute over that in the courts. And so the state wanted to get out of the business of having this sort of conversion factor. But if they got rid of if they got rid of the conversion factor, then some people, like those with hearing losses, would lose out, because their ultimate earnings losses tended to be higher than their initial disability. And so one of the things that the state did was keep those benefits high for everybody, independent of what type of injury it was. So if you go to the next slide, this little graphic represents different types of injuries. So injuries to the eye, injuries to the hands, nose, or feet. And these tend to have low earnings losses compared to the amount of disability that you have. But in order to keep, in order to get out of the business of, oh, sorry. Is there a question? No. So in order to have everybody have the same conversion factor from the injury to the permanent disability, these folks actually won out quite a bit. So people with these types of injuries got a much higher ultimate disability rating in terms of earnings losses than they would have under the old system. So these folks won out, so to speak, won out more than people with hearing losses, just because they wanted to make sure that there were no losers. Another example, let's go to the next slide, is age. So there was an age conversion factor, which means that if two people have an identical injury, absolutely identical, but they're different ages, let's say one is 30 and one is 60, the system would give more benefits to the 60-year-old than to the 30-year-old. And there was a lot of discussion about that, because people were saying, well, actually the 30-year-old has a lot more earnings ahead of them, and so if they're permanently disabled, then maybe actually the younger person should get more of a benefit, more money, than an older person, because they're going to sustain that permanent disability for a longer working period. And so there was some talk about getting rid of this conversion that gives more money for the same injury to older folks. By the way, this actually is my grandmother. What that would have done, however, is it would have caused older people, if they got rid of it, it would have caused older people to get fewer benefits under the reform, while younger people got more benefits in order to balance it all out. And they realized right away that, again, under the rubric of no losers, they certainly were not going to have older people, older workers, be disadvantaged by the reforms, because that would absolutely not make it through the political process, regardless of whether it was fair or not. And so that's something that we talked about reforming, but we left alone because we wanted there to be absolutely nobody who was disadvantaged from the reforms. One more. Let's go to the next slide. And another piece that was changed were the minimum and maximum benefits for a week per week. So what happens is you get a permanent disability rating, and then depending on how much money you make, depending on your income, that rating converts into a dollar amount. Well, your income is looked at on a weekly income, and there were some fairly low minimums and maximums, which means that most people hit the maximum. And so this occupy is meant to signify that, sometimes, and part of the point of the occupy movement is that a lot of times the benefits go to the top 1% or 0.1%, whereas the vast majority of people don't see the benefit in terms of income. And in this reform, they really wanted this to be the opposite. And so by increasing the minimum and maximum, you can see there the maximum benefit held down benefits for 85% of injured workers. In other words, 85% of injured workers, their income hit the maximum that was allowable. And in the reform, we increased the maximum and thus increasing the benefit to 85% of injured workers. And then the minimum was impacted, 8% were impacted by the minimum, which was also raised, so that those who are earning the least amount of money were getting a raise as well through the reform by increasing the minimum benefit. So overall, this reform increased benefits for at least 93% of injured workers. So it's kind of the inverse of the Occupy movement, where really everybody or almost everybody saw some gains from it. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So the next slide, again, this is sort of the overview of what happened in the reforms. On the left-hand side are the permanent disability changes, which we've gone over. On the right-hand side are the savings. And the first savings, I think I'm only going to go over two of them. One is the liens and the second is IMR. And so the liens, basically what that was about is people would go for treatment, whether it was medical treatment or sometimes a translator, things like that. And sometimes the employer or the insurance company would not think that that was a reasonable expense or reasonable treatment, and they would not pay. And then what would happen is the attorney or the injured worker would go and or the medical provider would file a lien saying, hey, you owe me money for this service which was provided. And the problem was that the claims couldn't be closed until all the liens were closed, and even if some of these liens were frivolous, there was no incentive, there was no way to close them out, and so they were sort of clogging up the system, and employers and insurance companies wound up paying just to settle these to have them go away, whether they were legitimate or not. And so what the part of the reform was to say, hey, let's put some controls on these liens because they were growing. And what this slide shows is the number of liens by month over time, and you can see that it was quite a wild ride. 2000 through 2003, there was a big buildup, and then the state instituted a $100 filing fee, which means that in order to file a lien, you had to pay $100. And you can see starting in sort of mid-2004, the beginning of 2004, there was a huge drop in the number of liens just from that $100 filing fee, because a lot of these were just filed with the expectation of collecting, pennies on the dollar. But, even pennies are worth something, but maybe they don't add up to a $100 filing fee. And so now it's no longer worth it to file these. So we had a $100 filing fee, and then the filing fee went away in mid-2006. And you can see that the number of liens shot upwards again. And then they did some system controls in 2008, and then the number of liens went down. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that by 2011, the number of liens had shot up quite a bit again. 2011 was already higher than the numbers that we'd seen in the prior graph. And then in 2012, just the fourth quarter of 2012 by itself was as high or higher than all the liens that were filed in 2011. So there were 463,000 liens in 2011, and just the fourth quarter of 2012, there were over 500,000 liens. So these things were just multiplying. And so part of SB 863 was to institute a filing fee, and lo and behold, you go to the next slide, the liens went away, or not completely went away, but they went back down to sort of their historically low levels. And so this was a major success in the reforms, not only reducing costs, but also allowing employers, self-insured employers and insurance companies to close out claims and not have to keep them open just for these liens. Just one more thing I'll add is you can see the green versus the yellow bars. Green is the LA area. It's the 5-county LA area. And yellow is the entire rest of the state. So liens were really specifically a Los Angeles problem. I mean, the rest of the state did not have a problem with liens in the way that Los Angeles did. So, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. In many ways, Southern California and Los Angeles particularly really does not behave like the rest of the state when it comes to workers' compensation. And I think the most clear example of that is right here, where you can see almost all of these liens were coming from LA. And as a result, when the reform came along and got rid of a lot of these liens, really the Los Angeles area was one of the biggest beneficiaries of the reform, because they were the ones that were suffering the most prior to the reforms. All right, so we'll go to the next slide. The next savings was what we call IMR, which is independent medical review. So what that means is when there's a medical dispute in the workers' compensation system, let's say a doctor recommends a certain treatment, and an insurance company or a self-insured employer says, we don't think that treatment is right. You have a dispute, and the question is, do you get to do that treatment or not? And if so, who's going to pay for it? Well, it used to be on the lower right-hand corner that it went to the courts. And so literally we had workers' comp judges determining whether medical procedures were appropriate or not. And so folks decided that wasn't a good, that was sort of a mismatch of expertise. That wasn't a good system. And so they went to what's called independent medical review, where now when there's a dispute, people get all the files together, they send them over to a third-party medical reviewer who is paid by through the state or they're employed through the state, and that independent medical reviewer has expertise in the particular field of the dispute, of the the type of medical transaction or the medical procedure, and so that's the new process. Now, one of the big objections to that, it sounds like a no-brainer. You'd rather have a doctor reviewing whether a medical procedure is appropriate or not than a judge. But one of the disputes about this is I have a little blindfold in front of the doctor, and the reason is that it's really at arm's length. You don't know who the doctor is. You never get to find out who the doctor is. The doctor never meets with the injured worker. The doctor is simply reviewing medical files and making a determination based on the medical evidence. So and there's no way to go back or fight an IMR decision. So there are some legal disputes over IMR, partly because it's sort of anonymous and it can't be contested. If we go to the next slide, though, we will see that IMR has been used quite a bit. So we looked at the number of medical disputes prior to the reforms, and there was something like 40,000 a year. And as soon as IMR went into place in the third quarter of 2013, we started seeing almost more than 40,000 per quarter. So the number of medical disputes suddenly shot up by at least fourfold, if not more. And part of the reason of that, I think, is that IMR is free to the injured worker and their attorney. And so if an injured worker feels like, or their doctor feels like they need some treatment, and that treatment is denied, then they can go to IMR and get that reviewed essentially for free. So why would you not do it? So now, whereas before you had to go to court and there was some cost to it. So the number of disputes actually went up quite a bit with IMR, and we were not quite anticipating quite this much of an increase. However, if you go to the next slide, you will see that actually the number of claims that have been closed after IMR and after the lien change has increased quite a bit. And I'm not going to go through all the lines here, but basically the green lines are higher than the yellow lines, which are higher than the red lines. And what that means is that sort of across the board, the green lines are the more recent activity. And so what that means is that the more recent activity shows that claims are closing at a much faster pace than they used to. Again, part of that is because liens have largely gone away, and so folks are able to settle them. And secondly, because independent medical review has been working a little bit more quickly in terms of resolving disputes than what the old process was. At least that's the goal. We go to the next slide. So that's all I was going to sort of talk about in terms of what happened in the reforms. This is a slide of all sort of the Rating Bureau has a bevy of diagnostics that we look at to see what's happening in the system and is the reform having its intended consequences. So here's just a list of a bunch of them. But if we go on to the next slide, then we see, again, who are the winners and the losers from the reform. So the winners, clearly injured workers in general getting higher permanent disability benefits. Clearly Southern California, because again, they were suffering the most from the liens. Folks who had specific types of injuries are disproportionately benefiting. Again, those with eyes, nose, hands, and feet injuries are benefiting more than those, for example, with loss of hearing. Another winner, if we go to the next slide, are the nerds, people like me, because part of SB 863 was to require more reporting from an actuarial analysis from self-insurers, particularly private sector self-insurers, so that the state could better oversee the risks that particularly private self-insurers represent. Because one of the issues is that if a private self-insurer were to default on their workers' comp claims, then those injured workers still need to get all the medical care and the indemnity benefits that they deserve. And so the state wants to make sure that they have a handle on what that risk is and how much those dollars could possibly be and what the exposure is and all that other kind of stuff. So much as LeBron and Dwayne Wade would like to be actuaries, clearly here they're actuarial wannabes. The true winners, some of the true winners in this reform were actuaries. You go to the next slide. There's still a lot of ways that California is very different from the rest of the country in terms of workers' comp benefits, so there's still a lot of work to do. One of those is our extremely low payout pattern, or our extremely extended payout pattern or medical treatment pattern, really. So in the black dotted bar represents the percent of all medical costs that are paid within a year of injury. So you can see that of all the medical costs that are paid on an injured worker on an injury, roughly 10% are paid in the year of injury, roughly 15% are paid in the following year, and then fully like 75% are paid after the second year. So the medical treatment in California tends to be extremely extended. It goes on for many, many, many years, much, much more than in other states. You can see some states even 50% of the total medical care is paid within the first year. That's very different than California, where it's only 10%. So one of the things that I think folks are still looking at is why is it that medical treatment in California seems to go on for so long in comparison to other states? And maybe it's not a good thing. Maybe it means that the medical care is somehow lacking in California or not as quick. But maybe it's a good thing, and maybe the other states are cutting off medical care that they should not be cutting off in the later years. So we're still trying to wrap our hands around exactly why the treatment patterns are so different in California than in other states. The next slide shows that there's another difference between California and other states, which is our permanent disability claim frequency. So the first two columns there, the cases recorded and lost time, those represent how much California deviates from other states in terms of OSHA statistics of injuries, even lost time injuries. We look sort of like a middling state. We're very similar to other states. Our claim frequency is almost exactly, within 5% of the claim frequency of other states. But now if you go over, and the same thing with temporary disability claims in the workers' comp system, we look very much like other states. But now in permanent disability, for some reason, we have a far, almost 50% higher frequency of permanent disabled injuries in our workers' comp system than in other states. So it's kind of a puzzle. Why is it we seem to have the same number of injuries or same frequency of injuries as other states? We seem to have the same frequency of not as serious injuries in terms of temporary disability. But then when it comes to permanent disability, we have a much, much higher frequency. So that's, again, another sort of puzzle of why California is so different than other states. The next slide shows claim frequencies. And so again, we have this by region, and this first slide is just going to show the insurance world. So this is not UC specific, though we'll get to that later. And you can see the three regions, Bay Area and other regions in LA, all sort of had some big frequency decreases between 2004 and 2007. But if we go to the next slide, you can see that while the other regions, the Bay Area and other, continued to decrease through 2012, the Los Angeles area frequency just went up. So for whatever reason, Los Angeles has just completely diverged from the rest of the state in terms of claim frequency. And I added a new purple line there, and that purple line is where the rest of the country is in terms of its change in claim frequency. So I think the message here is that the rest of the country, as well as really the non-Los Angeles part of the state, are behaving fairly similarly in terms of having steady or decrease in claim frequency since 2007, but Los Angeles has completely diverged in their experience. So now let's look a little bit at UC. This slide shows, again, the campuses for the north, and kind of similar to what the prior graph showed for Northern California, a decrease in claim frequency since 2008-2009. The next slide shows how Southern California is faring, and actually, unlike the rest of the state, unlike the insurance world, UC's Southern California campuses and medical centers show a decrease in claim frequency, whereas the insurance world, they're showing an increase. So this is a really great result, I think, for UC, that there isn't that big difference between Northern and Southern California, that they're both able to show a decrease in claim frequency, whereas in the rest of the state there's a very, very big divergence. Let's go to the next slide. Another statistic that's very interesting to me is cumulative injuries. So these types of claims these are sort of repetitive motion or other cumulative injuries which don't occur all at once. It could be from breathing something over a long period of time and developing respiratory problems, things like that. And again, one of the messages here, this is an index of claim frequency, and again, that green line from Los Angeles shows that they have had a big increase in cumulative frequency, much bigger than the Bay Area has experienced, which has been pretty steady since 2007. And bigger than the rest of the state or other, which has been sort of in between the Bay Area and Los Angeles. So to compare that to UC, let's go to the next slide here. This is actually UC's experience shows the opposite. Here, actually, in UC's Northern California campuses, particularly campuses, we've had a very big increase in cumulative injury claims, and this is something I think that we're probably going to be looking at to try to figure out why this happened. But again, in the insurance world, Northern California was kind of steady, but here for UC, Northern California had a big increase. And then if we go to the next slide, you'll see that for Southern California, for UC, it's actually been fairly steady. So here we have a reversal where the cumulative injuries for Southern California are pretty steady for UC, but we've had an increase in Northern California, so which is opposite than what's happening for other employers in the state. So again, a really good result though for UC Southern California campuses and medical centers. It shows that y'all are able to sort of buck the trend of what's going on in Southern California for other folks. A couple other things I'll just go over quickly. One is how much an injury costs varies depending what a big impact that age of the injured worker has. So here, each bar here represents a different cohort depending on the age. So the left-hand side is 20 to 30-year-olds, and we have 30 to 40-year-olds, and so on. And we can see that as folks get older, their injuries tend to cost a lot more. And this is a combination of medical and lost wage benefits. Now, UC has a similar trend. So UC shows that, again, for 50 to 60-year-olds, they tend to cost a lot more than 20 to 30-year-olds, though in general the costs are lower than the state. The blue bars are generally lower than the red bars, but they do increase with age. So it's kind of a similar pattern, but at a lower level, which is it's nice that it's at a lower level. So the question is, why did this happen? And if we go to the next slide, you can see that the major reason really is that younger folks tend to have a much lower percentage of permanent disability claims, which are more serious and more expensive than the older folks. So focusing on the green there, you can see that 20 to 30-year-olds, only about 4% of their claims are permanent disability claims, whereas for 60 to 80-year-olds, it's 21%. So very big difference in terms of how many, what percent of claims are permanent disability. So this is a statewide statistic, and then for fun, I decided to see what would happen with UC, and you can see it looks very, very similar. So UC behaves very similar to the rest of the state in terms of the impact of the age of an injured worker on their claim cost and whether they're permanent disability or not. Let me go to the next slide. Again, a little more work to do. I started off by saying that California in general has very high expenses. Unfortunately, they've gone up. So the latest Rating Bureau filing for 7/115, which there'll be a rate hearing in a couple of days on that, the expense load went up to 32.9%. So the reforms have not been able to really control the what I'd call the frictional costs in the system. So there's some work to do there. But on the other hand, if we go to the next slide, you can see that it has done a good job in terms of controlling total costs. These are the average filed rates by the Rating Bureau at different times, and the reforms took effect 1/113, or started to take effect. They've been sort of going on for different parts have been implemented at different times. But the newest filing shows a suggested rate of 246, which is right where it was, below where it was at 1/113. So as the evidence comes in, it does appear that it has been able to contain overall costs. Those early years, 14 and 15, I think we're still, we didn't really have enough evidence to know what kind of impact the reforms had, but now we have more and we can see that they have controlled overall costs. So again, in the spirit of a lot of work to do, here we have a roller coaster, and then the next slide shows the California workers' comp rates, average rates, and this is not UC, this is the entire state. And you can see it looks a lot like a roller coaster. As the next slide shows, they actually get superimposed on each other pretty nicely, unfortunately. So, so the workers' comp system continues to be a little bit of a roller coaster, and I continue to tell people, to improve the system, we don't really need to hit a home run, be the best, be the best state in the country or anything like that. All we really need to be is normal. If we were just average for the other states, that would be a big improvement. And the next slide kind of shows that. This dotted line shows the average rates. The black line shows the average rates for California, and the other lines show what the rates are for the country, where the low orange bar is the lowest rates in the country, the high orange bar is the highest rates in the country, and then all the other ones are sort of the quintiles in between. And those are all the states excluding California. And you can see that California has either been the highest or among the highest for most of the last, almost 20 years or so. And we can see even in 2014, even with keeping rates a little bit down, we still are the highest, if not among the highest, in the country. So we still have a lot of work to do just to be normal, which would be, frankly, a nice thing, just to be normal for California. Again, so just to conclude, these are some of the representations of the California workers' comp system that we talked about. Actually, I don't think we talked about Sleeping Beauty, but that's all right. It's a bit of a roller coaster. Would love to be normal, and the system was upside down before the reforms, and part of the reforms was trying to just sort of normalize that, and in a way that there would be no losers. So the next slide just shows, there's still a lot of work to be done. There's no rest for the weary here. There's a lot of regulators and a ton of other folks who are trying to keep those reforms going. And so unfortunately, like the squirrel, there actually is not a lot of rest going on here in the system. So that's all I had prepared. If there are any questions or comments, I'd be happy to take them.
Our phone lines are open if anybody has questions.
I just sent you an email by chat. This is Zach Adams in Virginia. Just wondering, in Virginia, there are many types of ergonomic claims that are denied on their face. The state will just not allow them to be considered. So repetitive injury, for example, is not a compensable injury in Virginia. Could that be a factor in influencing your rates, in that the state recognizes a more broad category than other states?
Absolutely, yes. And those would be, I think I showed some slides before that showed cumulative injury claims. Those would be considered to be cumulative injury claims, and those do represent a substantial and growing percentage of permanent disability claims in California, or even temporary disability, but yes.
Would it be possible to get some information from you on what percentage that represents? Because as we make a case in Virginia to start recognizing those kinds of injuries, the question will be asked, okay, what's the cost going to be to us? As a self-insured state system, I know that my university pays out more in claims pays more for premiums than we actually pay out in claims, so we're subsidizing the other state systems. So in our case, there's latitude to recognize a broader scope of injury types than we currently are.
Right. I could certainly send you information on cumulative injuries in California. I'd have to think about what a source would be for nationwide statistics, but I certainly have the info on California.
That'd be very helpful.
Sure. And you said you sent me an email?
I will send it. I need your email address.
I'll
okay.
I'll put the address in the chat box, Zach.
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. And do we have any further questions? If not, thank you very much, Mark. This was a very interesting presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you for future ERM Toolbox webinars.